Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be trapped in a storm so merciless that every breath burns your lungs, every step sinks you deeper into death, and the people you once trusted become your last hope yet also your greatest fear? This is not fiction. This is not a campfire legend. This is the true story of the Donner Party. In the winter of 1846, nearly 90 pioneers set out to claim a better life. Families, children, friends, ordinary people chasing the dream of California. They carried wagons filled with hope, supplies stacked high, hearts pounding with the promise of a golden land. But what awaited them was not gold, not freedom, not even mercy. It was hunger. It was madness. It was the kind of horror that changes history forever. The Sierra Nevada mountains rose like jagged teeth before them, a silent predator watching its prey wander willingly into its jaws. The snow came early that year, thick and merciless, and as the flakes began to fall, the settlers realized they were caught in something they could not escape. The storm would not end. The path behind them closed with ice. The path ahead buried in white, and there, stranded in the cold, the Donner Party began their descent into unthinkable choices. At first, they clung to hope. They rationed their food. Flour turned into thin, watery gruel, scraps of bacon sliced into near-invisible slivers, coffee boiled until it became little more than bitter water. The children cried for more, but there was none to give. Each day, they grew thinner. Each night, the wind shrieked through the trees like a chorus of starving ghosts. The livestock began to die. First, the oxen, frozen where they stood. Then the horses, their bodies buried under snowdrifts, their eyes wide and glassy as if frozen in terror. The settlers skinned them, boiled their hides, chewed on leather just to keep something in their stomachs. The smell of boiling animal hide became the smell of survival, seeping into every crack of the cabins they built from fallen logs. But survival has limits, and the snow was not done. Weeks passed, the howling wind never quieted. The cabins filled with smoke from fires that could not keep out the cold. Children coughed, mothers prayed, fathers stared blankly at the walls, as if already seeing graves being dug beneath the snow. By Christmas, the reality could no longer be denied. They were not waiting out a storm. They were waiting to die. And then, the unthinkable began to whisper through the camp. First, in silence, a thought no one dared to say aloud. Then, in glances, eyes meeting in terror, lips trembling with words they refused to speak. And finally, in whispers, muffled by the crackling fire and the storm outside. What happens when the last ox is gone? What happens when there is nothing left? What happens when the only food is us? They told themselves it would never come to that. They were good people, Christians, settlers, families with children. They would endure. They would fight. They would wait for rescue. But hunger does not listen to faith. Hunger does not care about morality. Hunger is louder than prayer. One morning, the first body was found. Not killed, not murdered, only still, lifeless, frozen stiff in the corner of a cabin. A man who had simply not woken up. His family wept, the sound hollow and weak in their starvation. His wife covered his body with blankets, as if warmth could return him to life. But others stared. They stared too long, too ungrilly. The storm roared outside. The snow fell heavier, and inside that small wooden cabin, the eyes of the starving began to wander toward the corpse of their own neighbor. No one spoke, not yet. But the silence was louder than any scream, because deep down, they all knew what was coming. This was not survival anymore. This was something else. Something darker, something far more terrifying than death itself. The Donner Party had entered the storm. And the storm had entered them. The corpse lay stiff beneath a thin sheet of linen, its edges frozen solid from the breath of winter that slithered through the cracks in the cabin walls. The man's widow sat silently beside him, eyes glassy, rocking herself back and forth. Her children clung to her, too weak to cry, their lips cracked and bleeding from thirst. No one dared to say it. Not yet, but hunger had already spoken, silently gnawing at their insides like an invisible beast. The days blurred together in the endless storm. Snow buried the wagons. Trees bowed under its weight. Even the sky seemed swallowed by a gray void, as if God himself had turned his face away. Time was marked not by sunrise or sunset, but by the deepening ache in their bellies. At night, the wind screamed so loudly that it sounded like voices, hundreds of them pleading, wailing, whispering. Mothers covered their children's ears, but the storm's voices were inside as much as outside, seeping into their thoughts, feeding on their fear. Then came the first whisper, not of the storm but of the living. It happened around the fire, a weak flame barely holding against the cold. 4 men huddled close, their faces gaunt, their shadows stretching long and monstrous against the walls. One of them spoke in a low, trembling voice. We could use him," he muttered, nodding toward the cabin where the widow and her dead husband lay. The others froze, their hollow eyes flicking toward him in horror. One spat into the fire, the saliva sizzling into nothing. "You're damned," he hissed. "You'll burn for even thinking it." But the man didn't stop. His hands shook as he rubbed them together. "Not from cold, but from desperation. We'll all burn if we starve. Better to eat than to join him." The silence after those words was thicker than the snow outside. No one spoke, but no one denied it. Later that night, the widow's cries broke through the storm. Her children wailed with her, weak little sounds that clawed at the hearts of those nearby. And yet, the settlers who heard it from their own cabins closed their eyes tighter, not out of sympathy but out of temptation. The next morning, the man's body was gone. No one asked. No one explained. But the settlers who had once shared laughter on the trail, who had once broken bread around cheerful campfires, no longer looked each other in the eye. The storm grew heavier, as if feeding on their sin. By now, snowdrifts towered higher than the cabins. Paths between shelters were nothing more than tunnels carved by trembling hands. Children grew too weak to walk, their bones sharp beneath thin blankets. Men tried to hunt, but the forest was silent. The Diargona River is frozen, traps returned empty, snares untouched. Nature had abandoned them. It was around this time that they spoke of leaving, a forlorn hope. They called it a groove, who would try to cross the mountains on foot, find help, and bring it back before the rest perished. 15 men and women gathered their meager supplies. Scraps of food, a few tattered blankets, snowshoes carved from bits of wood and hide. They kissed their families goodbye, promising they would return with salvation. But those left behind watched them vanish into the white wilderness and felt only dread. The snow swallowed them in minutes, erasing their tracks as if they had never existed. Days later, whispers drifted back from the mountains, not carried by messengers, but by fear itself. The forlorn hope had faced horrors worse than the storm. Lost in the blinding snow, frostbitten and starving, they had begun to look at each other not as companions, but as meat. One girl claimed she dreamed of them every night. Her friends, her neighbors, their faces gaunt and eyes hollow, reaching out for her with blood-stained hands. She woke screaming, her family holding her down as she thrashed, still trapped in the nightmare. The settlers stopped speaking of rescue after that. Inside the cabins, the people dwindled. Each day, someone else failed to rise. And each night, the shadows moved strangely around the fires, as if something more than the living sat waiting in the dark corners. The smell of boiling leather mixed with another smell, heavier, sweeter, one that no one dared to name. Children grew silent, their eyes wide and haunted. Some whispered of shapes in the snow figures standing just beyond the tree line, watching. Tall, skeletal forms with hollow eyes and long fingers. "They're waiting for us," one boy said, his voice so soft it was nearly a breath. "Waiting until we can't walk anymore." The adults told him it was just the storm, just shadows. But when the boy vanished days later, his little boots left in the snow outside the cabin, no one searched for him, no one said a word. The hunger had stolen their humanity. The storm had stolen their mercy, and the mountains had stolen their hope. What remained was only fear and flesh. The cabins had grown quieter. The sounds of laughter, prayer, and even argument were gone. What remained was the crackle of weak fires, the moan of the wind, and the faint rustle of bodies shifting restlessly under blankets too thin to keep out death. Those still alive no longer spoke of California. They no longer spoke of spring, or gold, or even God. Their voices were saved for a single purpose: to barter, to beg, or to whisper in hushed tones when another neighbor failed to rise in the morning. The snow had no mercy. It fell without end, piling higher until the roofs sagged under the weight. Men spent hours digging tunnels just to reach firewood, their fingers black with frostbite, their nails cracked and bleeding. Some never returned from those trips, their bodies swallowed by drifts that seemed eager to bury them alive. Inside, the air stank of sweat, smoke, and rot. The children coughed endlessly, their ribs pressing against their skin. Their mothers tried to soothe them, but their own lips were too dry, too cracked, their own bellies gnawed hollow. And always, in the corners, lay the bodies. They were wrapped at first, respectfully covered with cloths or blankets, but those wrappings grew thinner as the days stretched on. The cloths were burned for kindling, the blankets were stripped for the living, and the bodies remained, frozen, pale, silent. Some settlers prayed beside them, asking forgiveness for the thoughts that slithered into their minds. Each time their eyes lingered too long, others avoided looking at all, ashamed of the hunger that twisted their guts. But not everyone resisted. It began with muttering, with words spoken too loudly in the night. Better to live with guilt than to die with faith. It continued with arguments, with fists clenched and tears shed. And then, one morning, it was no longer a question. A man rose from the fire, his cheeks sunken, his eyes dark as holes. He staggered to the corner where a young boy's body had lain for 2 days. The boy's mother wailed as the man lifted the corpse, but she did not stop him. No one did. The settlers turned their faces away as he carried the body outside, into Tesno. The sound of chopping followed. A hatchet against bone, a blade through flesh. The smell drifted back into the cabin sickly sweet, mingling with the smoke of the fire. Some gagged, some wept, and some sat in silence, waiting for their turn. By evening, the pot was passed around. The widow who had once prayed the loudest now ate in silence, tears running down her face as she chewed. The man who had carried the body stared at the floor, his jaw working steadily, his hands trembling. Even the children, too weak to question, swallowed mouthfuls of the unthinkable, their eyes glassy, their innocence gone. It was no longer a matter of survival. It was a ritual, forced upon them by the storm itself. Outside, the forlorn hopes still struggled through the mountains. Days stretched into weeks, their numbers dwindling. One by one, they collapsed into the snow. Those who remained tore strips from their bodies, drying the flesh over fires, chewing it slowly, their faces blank, their eyes empty. When the survivors finally stumbled upon rescue, their lips were cracked with blood, their clothes stiffed with frozen gore, and though they spoke of snow and hunger and death, they did not speak of what they had done. Back at the camp, the settlers had grown accustomed to the silence. When someone died, there was no mourning. There was no weeping. Their body was set aside, and eventually divided. Some claimed they saw shadows moving in the cabins at night, shapes that resembled those who had already been eaten, standing silently in the corners, their eyes hollow, their mouths dripping with blood. Others heard voices whispering in the wind, urging them to eat more, to feed the hunger, to surrender. One girl swore she woke in the night to see her own father crouched beside her, staring at her thin arms, his mouth watering. When she cried out, he recoiled as though struck, retreating to the fire with shaking hands. But the thought never left her. The thought never left any of them. The line between the living and the dead blurred. The bodies became sustenance. The faces around the fire became potential meals. Trust was shattered, replaced with suspicion and dread. And still, the storm did not end. Each day the snow piled higher. Each night the wind grew louder. The cabins groaned under the weight, as if the mountains themselves sought to crush the settlers into silence. The Donner Party had entered the winter as pioneers, as families, as dreamers. But now, they were something else. Something that should not exist. They were both predator and prey, and the hunger had only just begun. By January, the storm had become less a season and more a prison. The mountains loomed like white walls on every side, cutting off escape. The snow tunnels they dug between cabins collapsed daily, swallowing tools and sometimes people. The sky itself was a constant, blinding gray, with no sunrise or sunset to mark time. It was as though the world had forgotten them. Inside, the settlers no longer measured days by meals, for there were none. They measured them by deaths, when a cough grew weaker, when a voice grew faint, when a pair of eyes lost their last flicker of light. Everyone knew another day had passed. Another body would be left in the corner. Another choice would be made. The children, once playful, had become silent. They lay in corners, too weak to move, their bones sharp against their skin. Sometimes, in fevered dreams, they whimpered for bread or called out the names of animals that no longer existed. Their parents held them, whispering promises of California orchards, of fields of gold, of rivers that sparkled in the sun. Lies meant to comfort, lies even they no longer believed. One night, a man named Kesseberg began muttering to himself by the fire. His eyes were fever bright, his lips cracked and bleeding. "The flesh is better than leather," he rasped, staring at the boiling pot. "Better than bark, better than bones." The others shifted uncomfortably, but no one silenced him. They all knew what he meant. They all felt the same. Soon after, a woman woke screaming. She claimed she had dreamed of her husband long dead, long eaten standing at the foot of her bed, his mouth sewn shut, his hands reaching for her. She swore she smelled his breath, heavy and rotten, and when she woke, the smell lingered. The other settlers pretended not to hear her sobs. They were too afraid that what she saw might be real, because they, too, had seen things. Shadows that moved when the fire burned low, shapes crouching in corners, crawling along the ceiling beams, faces pressed against the frosted windows, pale and hungry, gone before anyone dared to look twice. The storm carried whispers through the cracks, voices calling their names, urging them into the snow. The settlers told themselves it was hunger, it was madness. But deep down, they wonder it. Had the mountains cursed them? Was something feeding on them, driving them to feed on each other? One evening, the snow outside fell silent for a moment, eerily, completely silent. The settlers froze, listening. In that silence, they heard a sound more terrifying than the wind. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps crunching the snow, circling the cabins. Heavy boots, dragging slightly. A man's shape passed the frost-glazed window, but when one settler threw open the door, there was nothing. No tracks, no figure, only the endless, unbroken white. That night, no one slept. The bodies continued to vanish, not disappear. Exactly, they knew where they went. Into the pot, onto the fire, into the mouths of neighbors and kin. But the way they were taken changed. At first, only the dead were eaten, but as days bled into nights, and nights into days, the temptation grew bolder. It was said one man struck his companion down in the snow, claiming afterward that he had stumbled. Others whispered that a child, too weak to stand, had been smothered by a hand pressed over her face, her tiny chest no longer rising. No one admitted these things. No one accused, but the fear grew thick, suffocating. The settlers no longer trusted each other. Every glance lingered too long. Every hand strayed too close to the hatchet. Families clutched their children tighter, whispering warnings not just of the storm, but of the neighbors across the way. And through it all, the hunger deepened. One woman, delirious with starvation, began singing lullabies to the fire. She rocked back and forth, crooning to the flames as though they were her child. When someone tried to pull her away, she hissed like an animal, her face twisted, her teeth bared. That night, she vanished. Only a trail of blood in the snow marked her absence, and by morning, even that was gone. The cabins had become tombs. Fires burned low, bodies huddled close, eyes glazed and lifeless. Outside, the storm roared. Inside, the silence pressed down like another layer of snow. The Donner Party had set out as pioneers chasing dreams. Now they were prisoners of the mountain, captives of the storm, slaves to the hunger that clawed at their insides. And in the stillness of night, when the wind paused, when the flames flickered low, every survivor knew the same terrible truth. Rescue might come. Spring might thaw the snow. But even if they escaped the mountains, they would never escape what they had become. Because once you've tasted flesh, the hunger never truly ends. By February, the camp no longer felt like a settlement. It felt like a graveyard, scattered with the living who had not yet lain down. The cabins sagged under the snow, their roofs creaking like coffins under strain. The walls bled smoke from small, choking fires, their wood blackened, their warmth weak. The settlers huddled close to what little flame remained, their faces hollow, their eyes reflecting shadows instead of light. It was said the mountains were alive, that they were watching, that they had closed their jaws on the Donner Party and would not let them go. The snow was not whether it was a curtain, hiding something vast and cruel that fed on human despair. At night, the settlers swore they heard it, not the wind, not the storm, but something deeper. A low, grinding groan from beneath the earth, as though the mountains themselves were shifting, hungry. And always, the hunger inside the cabins echoed that sound. The dead were no longer left to rest. There was no ritual, no prayer, no covering of the eyes. They were stripped, carved, divided. Neighbors took what they needed and left the rest. The bodies became shapes, no longer people. Flesh became fuel, but some began to see more than meat. One man gaunt, his lips cracked, his eyes sunken, claimed he had spoken with the dead. He said the ones they ate whispered to him in his sleep, telling him where to cut, telling him who would die next. He spoke of it calmly, as though it were guidance, as though it were mercy. The others avoided him, but they could not deny the truth. His whispers proved right. Each time he muttered a name, someone fell ill, someone failed to rise, someone was dragged to the corner. The survivors began to fear him more than the storm. Meanwhile, the forlorn hope those who had left to find salvation were fading into legend. Stories drifted back, half-truths and rumors that they had eaten their own shoes, then their own dead. That they had killed to keep moving, that they had sworn never to speak of what they had done. Empty cabins, settlers clung to those stories like mirrors. If the forlorn hope had fallen, perhaps they were not monsters after all. Perhaps this was simply survival, but the justifications grew thinner each day. One night, a fight broke out between two men, both gaunt, both starving, both staring at the same body, cooling in the corner. Words became shouts. Shouts became blows. Blows became blood. When the others pulled them apart, one man lay still, his skull cracked against the frozen floor. The fight ended in silence. The silence ended in feasting. Trust shattered completely after that. No one slept deeply. Hatchets and knives were kept close at hand. Families barricaded their doors, not against the storm, but against their neighbors. And still, despite their vigilance, the numbers dwindled. Some died quietly, slipping into the snow of fever dreams. Others vanished entirely, gone into the white, leaving only footprints that ended a few yards from the cabins. It was as if the mountain itself had swallowed them whole. The children were the weakest. Their eyes stared without blinking, their cheeks hollow, their voices gone. Parents rocked them, sang to them, whispered promises of orchards and rivers. But the promises carried no warmth. When a child went still, the wail of grief that followed was brief. Grief was quickly smothered by hunger. Even the parents who wept hardest were seen later with blood on their lips. By now, the settlers spoke little. Their words had no power. Their prayers had no answer. They communicated in glances, in nods, in the scraping of knives against bone. The sound of chewing was louder than conversation, the smell of flesh thicker than smoke. And yet, some claimed they were never alone. One woman said she saw tall, thin figures in the tree line, watching silently, their eyes black pits, their mouths dripping with frost. Another swore she heard voices in the snow calling her name, urging her to step outside, to join them. A child whispered of a man with no face who crouched at the window every night, tapping softly on the glass. The others told them it was madness, hallucinations born of starvation. But in the dead of night, when the flames burned low and the shadows grew long, even the strongest men stared at the frosted windows and wondered if something waited beyond. Something ancient, something patient, something that had lived in those mountains long before the Donner Party had wandered into its jaws. The settlers were no longer certain who the enemy was. The storm, the hunger, the neighbors, or something else entirely. But one truth remained. The Donner Party had come chasing a dream, and in its place, they had awakened a nightmare that would never end. The wind cut across the Sierra Nevada like a knife, a shrieking reminder that the mountains showed no mercy. Each gust rattled the frail cabins the emigrants had built, carrying with it flurries of snow that crept through every crack in the walls. Inside, the members of the Donner Party huddled in silence, their breath rising like smoke in the freezing air. The firewood pile was shrinking, and so were the people themselves, skin stretched over bone, eyes sunken into hollow sockets. Mary Graves sat near the embers, staring at her hands. They trembled violently, not just from the cold, but from weakness. Her father had promised that help would arrive, that someone would push through the storm to rescue them. But weeks had passed, and no rescuers came. The food was gone. Even the leather strips they had boiled into bitter, rubbery broth had run out. That morning, Patrick Breen had written in his journal, "Snowing fast. Wind blows heavy. Looks as likely to continue as not. We are very sickly. Some will not last long." Those words lingered in Mary's mind. Some would not last long. The truth hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Night fell, and with it came the sound, groaning and creaking of the ice, as if the very mountain were alive. Sometimes, in the silence between the gusts, they thought they heard voices outside, faint cries carried on the wind. Some swore it was other emigrants calling for help, while others muttered that it was the mountain itself, mocking them. In the Kesseberg cabin, the atmosphere was worse. Louis Kesseberg had grown unpredictable, muttering to himself in German, his eyes darting at the bodies of the weaker emigrants. When one of the Murphys' children whimpered that she was hungry, Kesseberg snapped, slamming his fist against the wall. "Hunger is all you know now," he hissed. His shadow loomed against the firelit logs, monstrous and twisted. That same night, tragedy struck again. Franklin Graves, Mary's father, took his last breath. His daughters wept softly, but there was no strength left in them for a proper mourning. His body lay still in the corner, a silent weight pressing on everyone in the cabin. The others looked away, but the thought crept into their minds like a poisonous whisper. His body meant food. His flesh meant survival. It was Patrick Breen who first dared to speak. His voice cracked with both fear and shame. If we do not use what God has left us, then all of us will perish. Better to save the living than let more die." Madi recoiled, horror striking her heart. To eat her father. The idea was monstrous, blasphemous, but the image of her younger siblings' hollow eyes gnawed at her resolve. They were starving. They were dying. And outside, the snow only grew deeper. They prayed before they did it. Some turned their faces away, refusing to look. Others forced themselves to take part, knowing that their survival depended on it. The knife that cut into Franklin Graves' body might as well have sliced open their humanity. Each piece of flesh carved away was a piece of their souls lost forever. The silence as they ate was unbearable. No one spoke. No one dared to look into another's eyes. The fire crackled, and the wind howled. But within the cabin, the only sound was the chewing of desperate mouths. Mary forced herself to swallow, tears streaming down her cheeks. She wanted to scream, to claw the food from her stomach, but she couldn't. Her body craved the nourishment. Her siblings needed her strength. That night, she dreamed of her father. He stood in the snow, his face pale and hollow. His lips moved, but she could not hear the words. Then he raised his hand, pointing at her. Mary woke with a start, her body drenched in cold sweat. From that moment forward, The Donner Party was bound together by a horror too great to name. They no longer looked at each other the same way. Every glance carried suspicion, guilt, and fear. Who would be next? Whose body would be carved up to keep the others alive? And in the darkest corners of the cabins, Louis Kesselberg's eyes gleamed. He had tasted what the others had tried to deny, and he wanted more. The snow refused to stop. Day bled into night, night into day, but the storm raged endlessly, burying any hope beneath its crushing weight. The Sierra Nevada had become a prison, each flake of snow another stone sealing their fate. Inside the cabins, death had become a constant companion. The smell of it lingered, metallic and sour, mixed with the smoke of dying fires. The children whimpered in their sleep, their bellies gnawing with hunger. Some woke screaming, crying out for mothers who could not soothe them. Mary Graves sat by the doorway, staring at the drifting white outside. She didn't dare step out. Her toes were already blackened with frostbite, the skin numb and stiff, but staying inside was worse. The walls pressed in, thick with secrets, heavy with sin. Across the camp, in the Donner camp itself, things had turned even darker. George Donner lay weak, his arm infected from a cut that refused to heal. His wife, Tamsin, cared for him with what strength she had left, but her eyes had grown wild, desperate. Their children sat close, their voices soft as whispers of the wind, and always nearby lurked Louis Kesselberg. He was not the strongest man, nor the most respected. In fact, many despised him for his cruelty. Yet something had changed in him. His once shaking hands now moved with steady purpose, his voice low and persuasive. He no longer spoke of God or salvation, only survival. "You all cling to your morals," he said one night, his tone oily. "But tell me, where is your God now? Where are the angels to feed you, to warm you? The only salvation left is flesh, and flesh is all around us." His words silenced the cabin. No one looked at him, but no one dared argue. He was right, and that truth was worse than his voice. Soon after, Kesselberg began to change in more than just words. The others noticed the way he lingered near the sick, watching them with an intensity that made even the strongest uneasy. When a child coughed too hard, his eyes lit up. When an old man fell into silence, Kesselberg was the first to approach the body, the first to insist that nothing should go to waste. The children feared him most. They whispered that he moved differently now, quieter, like a predator. Sometimes they claimed to see him smiling in the dark, even when no one else was awake. Mary Graves had nightmares of him. In her dreams, she saw him crouching over her father's remains, blood dripping from his lips, his eyes glowing like embers in the firelight. When Sawoko would find Kesselberg staring across the cabin at her, as if he had seen the same dream. The lines between hunger and madness blurred more each day. One evening, when the snow let up for a brief moment, William Eddy decided to search the camp for firewood. He trudged through the snow toward the Donner tents, and what he saw chilled him more than the storm ever could. Through a thin flap of canvas, he glimpsed Kesselberg crouched low, his face lit by the flickering fire. Before him lay the body of a woman who had died days earlier. Kesselberg tore at her with his bare hands, gnawing greedily, his face smeared red. He did not look like a man anymore. He looked like something feral, something born of hunger and shadow. Eddy stumbled back, bile rising in his throat. He wanted to confront him, to drag him out before the others. But when Kesselberg's head snapped up, his eyes locked on Eddy's. There was no shame there, no fear, only hunger. And Eddy realized something terrifying. Kesselberg was no longer waiting for death to come to others. He was beginning to wonder what it would take to speed it along. That night, whispers spread among the camp. Some claimed Kesselberg had been muttering names in the dark, names of those still alive. Others swore he had promised them food, promising plenty if they only had the courage to do what he already had. The Donner Party had set out as pioneers, families bound by hope and faith. But now, in the frozen heart of the Sierra Nevada, something monstrous stirred among them, and Louis Kesselberg was its voice. The Sierra Nevada had become a tomb of snow, The drifts were so high they swallowed trees, leaving only their tops poking through like skeletal fingers. The camp lay buried beneath a white silence, broken only by the coughing of the weak and the low moans of the dying. In the Breen cabin, Patrick Breen still wrote in his journal, though his words had grown darker, smaller. His entries were a record not of life, but of slow decay. Cold this morning. Died last night. The children cry for bread. We have none. Snow falling again. The journal, once a prayer, was now a ledger of death. The Graves family fared little better. Mary Graves had stopped counting the days. Time itself had blurred. She often stared into the fire, her mind adrift. She thought of home in Illinois, of warm kitchens and bread fresh from the oven. The memory was so vivid it made her stomach cramp. Then she would blink and find herself again in the cabin, smoke stinging her eyes, her lips cracked and bleeding. But while many sank into despair, Keseberg grew stronger. He had become bold now, no longer hiding his hunger, no longer pretending to mourn when another fell. He spoke openly of the flesh as providence, his voice calm, persuasive, even gentle. Some hated him for it, but others, those with starving children, listened, because the truth was undeniable. When someone died, their bodies became food. One night, snow battered the cabin so hard the logs groaned under its weight. Inside, the emigrants huddled close to the fire, their faces gaunt, their eyes glassy. A child whimpered, "Mama, I'm hungry." The mother. Bare lips, blue hands trembling looked at Keseberg. He smiled, slow and patient, and reached toward the corner where the body of an old man lay covered with a thin cloth. He pulled it back, revealing pale skin and frozen flesh. "No one must starve," aside Sovli, his tone almost priestly. "God has given us what we need. You mustn't waste his gift." Some turned away, weeping, but others forced themselves to eat. The sound of chewing filled the cabin once more, a sound that seemed louder than the storm outside. That night, Mary could not sleep. She lay awake, listening. At first it was only the storm, then the coughing of the children. But then slow, deliberate, moving across the cabin floor. She held her breath, eyes wide in the dark. Through the dim light of the dying fire, she saw him, Keseberg, moving silently toward one of the sleeping children. He crouched low, watching, his hand hovering, as though measuring the distance between life and death. Mary's heart thundered in her chest. She sat up suddenly, her voice cracking. "What are you doing?" The others stirred, confused, muttering. Keseberg straightened slowly, his shadow stretching across the wall. His eyes gleamed in the firelight, but his voice was smooth. "I was checking the child," he said. "He doesn't breathe well. I only meant to see if he still lived." No one challenged him. They were too weak, too afraid, but Mary knew what she had seen. She knew the hunger in his eyes. The next morning, one of the Murphy children was dead. Keseberg insisted it had been the storm, the cold, the sickness. But when Mary saw him eat first, tearing eagerly into the small, lifeless body, she felt bile burn her throat. The others looked away. None dared stop him. None dared admit aloud what they all feared. Louis Keseberg was no longer waiting for death. He was beginning to decide who would die. The days bled together in a haze of smoke, hunger, and death. The Sierra Nevada pressed down on the emigrants with endless snow, a suffocating silence, broken only by the groans of those too weak to rise. The cabins had become charnel houses, wooden boxers, where the living shared space with the dead. But outside their prison, word of the stranded pioneers had reached civilization. In Johnson's ranch, far below the mountains, whispers spread like wildfire. A wagon train was trapped in the Sierra, cut off by storms. Some scoffed, saying no one could still be alive up there. Others muttered that if they were alive, they were already doing unspeakable things to stay that way. A relief party was formed, men hardened by frontier life, determined to push through the mountains with supplies. They packed flour, dried meat, blankets, and rifles. Their faces were grim. They knew what kind of nightmare might be waiting, but for the Donner Party, rescue was still only a rumor, a ghostly possibility lost in the snow. Inside the Breen cabin, Patrick Breen wrote again in his journal. "It is dreadful. We are all starving. If relief don't come soon, there will be none left to save." His hand shook so badly the ink smeared across the page. Mary Graves no longer prayed for Fudoni for an end. Her siblings lay weak around her, their faces waxy, their lips cracked. The memory of her father's flesh still lingered on her tongue, a taste she could not wash away no matter how she tried. Each night she dreamed of him, standing in the snow, pointing, accusing. But worse than the hunger, worse than the cold, was the constant presence of Kes. He moved differently, now quiet, deliberate. He was always watching, always listening. When someone coughed too long, his eyes narrowed. When someone lay still, his lips curled faintly, as if in anticipation. One night, a storm screamed outside, rattling the cabin walls. The fire had nearly died, its embers fading. Mary woke to a sauna, dragging noise, slow and heavy. She sat up, her heart hammering. Across the room, Kesselberg was pulling the body of Mrs. Eddy, who had died the day before, closer to the fire. "Stop!" Mary whispered, her voice trembling. He looked at her, his face half lit by firelight, his expression calm, almost gently. "The fire warms her." He sighed softly. "We mustn't let her freeze before she feeds us." Mary gagged, bile burning her throat. She wanted to scream. "To Strakeem." But the others only turned away. They were too far gone, too afraid. Some even nodded, ashamed, but resigned. That night, the smell of cooked flesh filled the cabin. By now Kesselberg had shed the last traces of humanity. He spoke openly of who would die next. "The old should give way for the young," he would murmur, his voice soft as silk. "Better one perish than all." He even laughed sometimes, a low, rasping chuckle that froze the others more than the storm ever could. The children feared him most. They whispered that he prowled at night, creeping close to those who slept. They swore his eyes glowed red in the darkness, like coals plucked from the fire. But no one dared confront him, because deep down, in the pit of their stomachs, they knew they needed what he provided. He had become the butcher of the Donner Party, the keeper of their survival. And somewhere far below the mountains, the first relief party was climbing, their boots breaking through the snow, their rifles heavy on their shoulders. They did not yet know what awaited them in the cabins. They did not yet know the name Louis Kessel, but soon they would. The mountains swallowed sound, but sometimes juiced. Sometimes the trapped emigrants thought they heard something beneath the wind. The crunch of boots on snow, the distant echo of men's voices. Hope flickered in their hollow chests, like a candle about to gutter out. But inside the cabins, the horror was already too deep to wash away. Mary Graves sat in silence, staring at her sister's brittle hair, her cracked lips, her trembling hands. She had fed her, given her every scrap she could spare, but the girl was wasting away all the same. Mary's heart broke with each shallow breath. Kesselberg, meanwhile, had grown bold beyond fear. He no longer waited for the dead, he sought them out, watching, choosing. His voice was soft when he spoke, but his words were like poison. "Better one than all," he whispered one night, his eyes drifting over the room. "The sick, the weak, they're already gone in spirit. Why wait for the body to follow?" The others turned away, too weak to argue, too hungry to pretend they hadn't thought the same thing. That evening, another Dita Murphy child, the wail of the mother, tore through the cabin like a blade, her voice cracking, raw, inhuman. She clutched the body to her chest, rocking, sobbing, refusing to let go. Kesselberg waited until her sobs turned to silence, until her arms grew limp from exhaustion. Then he stepped forward. "Let me help you," he said, his voice oily, his hands outstretched. "He can save the others." Mary's stomach twisted. She wanted to leap forward, to claw his face, but she was too weak. Her body little more than skin and bones. She watched as the mother, broken and beaten, released her child to him. The firelight flickered, shadows dancing across Kesselberg's face as he worked. His lips curled faintly, not into a smile, but something colder, a grim satisfaction. That night, Mary did not close her eyes. She could not. Every time she drifted, she saw his face, the blood on his hands, the quiet delight in his eyes. Outside, the storm broke for the first time in weeks. The moon shone pale across the snow, casting the mountains in an eerie silver glow. And down the pass, far below, the first relief party climbed higher, their breath steaming in the cold, their legs burning from the climb. They had heard stories, rumors of starvation, whispers of cannibalism, but nothing could prepare them for what they would find. By dawn, the emigrants heard it at last. Voices, real voices, calling through the trees. At first, they thought it was another hallucination, another cruel trick of the mountain. But then came the crack of rifle fire, not in violence, but as a signal. Help had come. Mary staggered to the door, her legs trembling. She pushed it open, snow falling in, and squinted through the blinding light. Shapes moved in the distance, men, tall and strong, carrying packs on their backs. Tears blurred her eyes. For the first time in months, she dared to believe. Rescue, salvation. But behind her, in the cabins, Shadows Kesselberg's eyes narrowed. His lips pulled into something that might have been a smile, but it was not relief. It was possession. He had grown strong in the darkness, fed on sin, built his power on the bodies of the dead. And now strangers were coming to take it all away. He would not let go so easily. The rescuers trudged through the drifts, their boots sinking deep, their breath steaming in the thin mountain air. They had pushed through storms that would have killed lesser men, driven by whispers of the stranded emigrants and the thought of children freezing in the snow. As they neared the camp, the stench hit them, first a sickly mixture of smoke, rot, and something else, something foul and unmistakable. Death. The men exchanged glances, their faces pale beneath frostbitten beards. Still, they pressed forward. They add to. The first cabin loomed out of the white, a crooked shape half buried in snow. Smoke trickled weakly from its chimney. The door creaked when they pushed it open. Inside, darkness clung to the corners. The air was thick, sour. Their eyes adjusted slowly, and what they saw froze them in place. Figures huddled near the fire, skeletal shapes wrapped in filthy blankets. Their eyes glimmered in the dim light, wide and glassy, like animals caught in a trap. Children with faces sharp as skulls, mothers with lips cracked and bleeding. And then there were the bodies. Some lay in the corners, covered with rags. Others were not whole. Flesh stripped from limbs, ribs gnawed. Bare. The rescuers staggered back, their stomachs lurching. One of the men choked out, "Dear God." A thin voice broke the silence. Patrick Brain, his journal clutched in his wasted hand, whispered, "You've come, at last." The rescuers rushed forward, offering food, blankets, pulling the living from the filth. Tears ran down their faces as they pressed dried meat into trembling hands, watching the survivors devour it with desperate ferocity. But not all eyes were grateful. From the shadows, Louis Casiba. He was stronger than the others, his frame not wasted in the same way. His eyes gleamed with a strange fire, his lips twisted into something between a smile and a sneer. He did not thank the rescuers. He did not even move toward the food. Instead, he stood tall, as though the cabin were his kingdom and the survivors his subjects. "You're too late," he said softly, his voice carrying through the room. "Most are gone, but they saved us. Their flesh, their ear, gift." His tongue flicked across his lips, slow and deliberate. The rescuers recoiled, their hands tightening on their rifles. One muttered a prayer under his breath. Mary Graves, her mouth full of bread, looked up at the men with wild, pleading eyes. "Take us away," she begged, her voice raw. "Please, before he does more." The rescuers didn't understand. Not yet. But they would. As they led the survivors from the cabin, Kesselberg lingered in the doorway, watching. Snow whirled around him, the mountain wind screaming through the trees. His eyes glowed in the pale light, and for a moment, whose the moment it was as if the Sierra itself had given birth to him. A creature of hunger and death. The rescuers carried the first wave of survivors down the mountain. But not all could go. There were too many, too weak. Some would have to wait until the rescuers returned, and Keseberg stayed behind. He stood in the shadows of the Donner camp, his breath rising in the cold, his gaze fixed on the bodies that remained. The rescuers had come, but the nightmare was far from over. The first relief party left as quickly as they had come, their packs laden with the weakest survivors. Children clung to their arms. Mothers wept as they stumbled down the pass. But not everyone could go. The rescuers promised to return, but promises meant little in the Sierra Nevada. Snow still fell heavy, and the journey was perilous. Those left behind watched them vanish into the white, their hope carried with them. The silence that followed was suffocating. Inside the cabins, only the faint crackle of the fire broke the stillness. The survivors who remained were too weak to speak, their voices reduced to shallow whispers. Some lay on the floor, barely stirring. Others sat upright, eyes vacant, staring at nothing. And then there was Keseberg. He had not left the fire since the rescuers departed. He sat there like a sentinel, his face half in shadow, his hands folded loosely in his lap. But his eyes never stopped moving, always scanning, always calculating. That night, the storm returned. The wind howled, rattling the cabins as if trying to tear them apart. Snow seeped through cracks, stinging the skin of those too weak to move. The cold gnawed at them like invisible teeth. A cry broke the night, one of the Donner children, fevered, calling out for water. Their mother tried to soothe them, but her body shook violently. Her lips blew. She collapsed beside the child, her breath ragged. Keseberg moved before anyone else. He knelt by the mother, his hand brushing her cheek almost tenderly. "She's slipping," he whispered. His voice was soft, but in the silence it carried like thunder. Better to let her go. Better to make use of what she leaves behind. The others looked away, too weak to protest, too afraid. By morning, the mother was gone. Her body lay still beside her child, who whimpered weakly, clutching her stiff hand. Keseberg wasted no time. He dragged the body to the fire, his movements methodical. His knife flashed in the dim light, cutting, carving, separating flesh from bone with a precision that made the others sick to watch. The child screamed, clawing at him, but Keseberg shoved him aside with a strength that seemed unnatural. "She feeds you now," he growled, his voice guttural, his face twisted in hunger. The smell of roasting flesh filled the cabin once again. Some turned their heads, gagging. Others, trembling and desperate, reached for what Keseberg offered. Their shim was drowned by the gnawing pain in their bellies. Mary Graves sat frozen in the corner, her hands clenched so tightly her nails cut into her palms. She wanted to stop him, to kill him, to drive the knife into his chest, but she had no strength left. All she could do was watch as Keseberg fed on the woman's body, his eyes closing in something like ecstasy. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, something worse howled a hunger that had swallowed Louis Keseberg whole. And as the days dragged on, as more bodies fell, his power only grew. He was no longer just a man among the survivors. He'd become something else. A predator. The Donner Party had come to the mountains as pioneers. Now, in the shadow of Keseberg, they were prey. Snowflakes whispered against the canvas of the tents, thin as parchment, useless against the shrieking winds that howled like wolves through the trees. Every breath became a battle. Every hour stretched into eternity. The snow buried the camp deeper, as if the mountain itself wanted to swallow them whole. Inside, the survivors no longer spoke of hope. They spoke only of survival. The Bodies, once friends, neighbors, loved ones, were no longer people, they were sustenance. It was the unspoken law now. The dead were silent, and the living were desperate. A sharp knife made from a broken saw carved into what remained of human flesh, portioned carefully, handed out like the most grotesque communion. Children chewed slowly, some crying as they ate, others too hollow to react. But with each meal, something shifted. They became numb, not just to hunger, but to the horror itself. The taste no longer brought revulsion. It became routine. Survival's cruel deception. Yet at night, their dreams betrayed them. Visions of those they consumed appeared at the edge of the firelight. Faces pale, lips blue, eyes accusing. Some woke screaming, others woke chewing, their jaws working unconsciously as if still gnawing on flesh. The snowpack groaned under the weight of the storm, echoing like thunder from within the mountain. The air smelled of rot, of smoke, of despair. When someone died, there was grief but fleeting. Survival demanded speed. The living pounced on the body before the cold stiffened it, their hands trembling not with sorrow but with hunger. A young boy, no older than 12, whispered one night, "If I die, don't eat me, please." His voice cracked, desperate. No one responded. The silence was heavier than the snow. The boy understood then. His words were promises no one could keep. Meanwhile, those who still clung to fragments of morality grew sick. A mother, after feeding on her neighbor, vomited violently into the snow, her body shaking with both shame and hunger. But within hours, her trembling hands reached back into the pot, scooping up what her body had rejected. Starvation was stronger than guilt. The forest around them grew quieter. Even the wolves had vanished, as though they, too, feared the cursed camp. The wind carried strange noises at night, groans, whispers, almost human cries. Some said it was the storm. Others, half delirious, swore it was the voices of the dead, haunting them, circling the camp, waiting for their turn. One evening, a man claimed he saw a movement in the trees. A woman, skeletal and pale, her eyes sunken, her limbs jerky. He screamed until his throat bled. When others rushed out, they found nothing but shadows and snow. Yet in the fresh powder were footprints, bare, human, too small for an adult. They dragged the man back into the tent, his eyes wide, words stumbling. "They're out there," he whispered. "The ones we ate. They're walking now." No one slept that night. They clutched their knives, waiting, listening. But nothing came. Only the storm, relentless, merciless. The fire dimmed, the last logs gone. Soon, only frozen flesh remained for both fuel and food. The line between horror and necessity blurred completely. They were no longer pioneers. They were prisoners in a white tomb, eating their way through death, waiting for the mountain to decide who would join the silence next. The first sign of rescue didn't come with fanfare, it came with silence. The storm finally broke after days that felt like years. The sky, once a swirling gray abyss, opened to reveal a thin, cold sunlight. It was weak, almost mocking, but to the survivors, it was a glimpse of something they'd nearly forgotten. Hope. But sunlight could not disguise the camp's horror. Bones lay scattered, stripped clean, gnawed to splinters. Skins had been peeled back, flesh boiled into broth, fat rendered to fuel meager fires. The air stank of smoke and decay, a stench so thick it clung to the hair, the clothes, the very skin of the survivors. And then, faintly, from the edge of the snow-packed forest, voices. At first they thought it was the dead calling again. But no, these voices carried strength, carried life. Shapes appeared among the treesmen, strangers, wrapped in furs and armed with rifles. Rescue parties. The survivors staggered toward them, gaunt shadows with hollow eyes and skeletal hands. Some fell to their knees, sobbing. Others clutched their rescuers desperately, as though they might vanish like ghosts. But the rescuers, though moved by pity, recoiled from the smell, from the sight of their frost-bitten faces, their cracked lips stained with dried blood. "What happened here?" one rescuer whispered, though he already knew. The evidence was everywhere. His stomach turned as he stepped around the remains of what had once been human beings. He could not meet the survivors' eyes. A woman, her voice rasping from weeks of starvation, muttered, "We did what we had to." Her words were like a curse that settled over the rescuers' hearts. But salvation was cruel. They had brought food, yes, but not enough for everyone. Some survivors, so weakened, could not digest the sudden nourishment. A boy gulped down a piece of bread, only to convulse violently. foaming at the mouth before collapsing lifeless in the snow. Another choked on dried meat, his body rejecting it as though he had crossed too far into death to come back. Those who could walk began the treacherous journey down the mountain with their rescuers, but they did not leave the horror behind. Every step crunched over shallow graves. Every glance back revealed tents sagging under snow, filled with bodies untouched. So may consume it all abandoned. One man refused to leave. He sat in the snow, clutching the frozen corpse of his wife, rocking it gently, humming a lullaby that cracked in his throat. "I can't," he told the rescuers. "She'll wake up soon. She's only sleeping." They tried to pull him away, but his grip was iron. In the end, they left him there, his voice fading into the wind. As the rescuers led the survivors down the slope, whispers spread through the party. "Cannibals?" they said. They ate their own. The word clung to the air like frost. The survivors heard it too. They did not deny it. Some wept, others simply stared ahead, hollow, resigned. At night, in the camps set up by the rescuers, the survivors could not sleep. They would lie awake, staring into the fire, hearing the crunch of bones, the soft tearing of flesh, the whispers of those they had consumed. Even safe from the mountain, the ghosts followed. The Sierra Nevada loomed behind them, white and silent, as though guarding its secret. But the truth could not be buried under snow. It would follow them down, into the valleys, into the towns, into history itself, a story too monstrous to forget, yet too human to ignore. The journey down the mountain did not end the nightmare. For the Donner Party survivors, it only shifted the horror from the body to the soul. When they finally reached settlements in California, the townspeople did not embrace them as heroes. Whispers spread before they even arrived. People had heard of the delays, the snow, the starvation, and the truth that slithered behind every rumor. Cannibalism. By the time the survivors staggered into the villages, gaunt and hollow-eyed, they were already marked. Some locals looked at them with pity, others with disgust. Mothers pulled their children closer. Men refused to meet their gaze. The word Donna became a curse, spat like poison. They were alive, yes, but at a cost no one wanted to imagine. Each survivor carried their own shadow. Mary Graves, once vibrant and full of hope, could no longer bear the taste of meat. For the rest of her life, she flinched at the smell of cooking flesh. William Eddy, who had fought hardest to save his companions, became haunted by visions of those he left behind. He claimed he could still hear their cries at night, begging not to be forgotten. The children who survived bore scars deeper than any wound. Some never spoke of what they endured. Others spoke too much, whispering their secrets in nightmares, telling of faces that appeared in the dark faces of the ones they had eaten, standing silent, watching, and the mountain itself seemed cursed. Travelers who later crossed the Sierra Nevada spoke of uneasy feelings near Donner Lake, as though unseen eyes followed them. Some claimed to hear weeping in the wind, or the sound of knives on bone echoing faintly through the pines. The place where the camp once stood became a sight of dread, a reminder of hunger's power to strip away humanity. In the years that followed, the stories spread across America. Newspapers sensationalized the horror, turning it into a tale of both tragedy and warning. To some, the Donner Party became a symbol of the price of hubris of taking risks, ignoring warnings, venturing too far into the unknown. To others, it was a story of survival at any cost, proof of the brutal will to live. But for those who had lived it, there was no lesson, no meaning, only memory. They carried it until their final to taste, the screams, the snow. Some tried to bury it in silence, but silence cannot erase the sound of teeth tearing flesh. And so, the Donner Party became more than history. It became legend. A tale whispered at firesides, a warning to travelers, a nightmare passed from generation to generation. The snow still falls over Donner Lake each winter, white and silent, covering the land like a shroud. But beneath that silence lies the echo of what happened there, the hunger, the madness, the horror that men and women carried into eternity. And if you stand in the pines on a still winter night, some say you can still hear them. The cries of the dying, the gnaw of the desperate, the whispers of the consumed. The mountain remembers. It always remembers.